session. So basically, we are going to dive into how to apply data for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we will look at the pre and post assessment in order to build a strategy for DEI. I'm going to be talking about the case study of the DEI working group at RNW Media, and also to kind of give some examples of tips about how we have done the DEI work, and also the different criteria that we use at different phases, like not only in RNW Media team, but also we'll focus about the digital products that we run, as well as our partners and network. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariela. So we will go into the program now. Ninke, can you go to the next slide? Yes, thank you. So we have 2 hours together, and actually we will speak about 3 topics. So in part 1, we will start to understand why is it important but also difficult to measure diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then we will dive in a little bit into baseline assessments, because most of the organizations here, based on the survey we sent it to you in the end of the year, haven't done a DEI assessment or audit or baseline assessment. So the first part would be dedicated to exchange experience about how to start baseline assessment. And there we will invite some of participants here present to exchange their experiences. The second part, we will be a little bit more on the theoretical part. So we will share with you means to measure diversity, means to measure the feeling of inclusion, and give some tips to get started with the baseline assessment. And that, Mariela, what you said, you will share a little bit about your experience. And the third part will be dedicated to present like more generally indexes which are measuring more from the equity side. So what Gigi said, we invited 2 guests from the Racial Equity Index and the Equity Index to share about their approach. And then you will have a little moment for Q&A. And of course, you know that in this DEI learning trajectory, this is like more an input session, and then you will have some other sessions like small group discussions, which will follow up this workshop. But to dive in directly into the first part, Ninke, maybe you can skip to the second or the following slide. Yeah. No, this before. Yeah. So in my experience, when I created a DEI strategy, because this is the scope of this learning trajectory, I did define, clear objectives and indicators. And when I presented that to the decision makers of my organization, I could feel like a little bit of fear when it was the part of measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I was wondering why there was this fear, because you can measure all kinds of programs or finance aspects in your organization. But when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are some obstacles to, and I think it's also like mental, to measure diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that comes also part, and especially in Europe, from the history, you know, that when it was, the case of, for instance, a registration of Jew people during the Second World War, there was like this fear of what do we do with it, with this data? Because if the data is used, for public interests, which are, positively impacting the society, then it's a good thing. But you can also turn the data against the people who reveal their identity or the demographic aspects. So there is the fear of labeling people and putting people into boxes, and that is absolutely and completely understandable. It's a little bit different within the US systems, where people are more used to reveal their own identity markers or social markers, but in the Europe context, it's a little bit more difficult. And also the fear comes, of course, from organizations self, which are afraid, that you have to put in place a lot of systems, to gather data, to work and to monitor them. So that's also a very relevant question that you should be prepared when you are willing to measure diversity and inclusion. Also, another reason which was always told to me is that we can't measure diversity and inclusion because of the low compliance and privacy rules, which is partly true because we have, and especially in Europe, I focus a little bit more on this region, we have the GDPR regulation, which is GDPR is a general data protection regulation, which is actually protecting the private data of people. And that law, or that law is applicable to all countries. And then within countries, you have also special laws about privacy and data. So when you click I consent, for instance, when you go into a website, it's that you give consent to give your data for a particular purpose. And actually, you can't, in this law, gather information about racial or ethnical origin, or, for instance, you cannot gather data based on the person's sex life or sexual orientation. But there are exceptions, and that's how you can always have the law and then have exceptions also within the law, and that exception is including the notion of consent. Consent, and also the way that if you want to get the data, you have to ask consent and you have to explain why you got the data based on identity or social markers. So the argument of we actually cannot gather data because of the law is partly you can respond on that, and I will give you at the end of this workshop a lot of resources to understand how the law works within, especially the Netherlands, but also in the European context, and how to get the sense of an exception. The second part of that is, and that's also just for the law. Within the Netherlands, you can actually already get the data based on the gender, age, and nationality. So based on that, you can already, have, some demographics to understand, for instance, when it's the gender lens or the age lens or the nationality lens. But then regarding the ethnic origin or disabilities or sexual orientation, that you have to be a little bit more cautious. The question of trust is also something, because you can ask people, to gather data when you explain why you do it, and if it's integrated into a DI strategy, and that you say, what are we going to do with the data? Are you giving consent? You can always withdraw from, the data gathering, and you have to say that you will treat this data with anonymity, and that it's, this data about you, about your person, is used for this reason, because otherwise people will not trust you, and they are right not to trust you, because what I said about why should I reveal my personal identity, for which purpose? And I think it's really important, to before, putting like some process to check into a formulary or something like that, you need to explain why you gather data based on different identity aspects. And the third part is that mostly organizations which want to measure data do not know actually the purpose of measuring. And I think we are here in this workshop to understand why we should measure diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that depends a lot from your organization and the purpose of your DEI strategy. And it depends also of the size of your organization and especially about what you want to achieve. So if you don't have a DEI strategy, which, yeah, we spoke about that in module 1, so some of you are a little bit more advanced into the DEI strategy, but if you don't have one, indeed there is no point, to address the sense of measuring if you don't have the clear objectives and the indicators where you want to go. So what is important also within your DEI strategy is to try to link your existing KPIs or indicators or objectives of your organization and to link them with your specific DEI strategy. And also what is important is that when you are setting, these indicators, for instance, we want to have more people of color in the board. That's one of the we want a half of a woman to be into leadership positions. That are indicators, for instance, that you can apply, for instance, in your organization, but that might also differ if your organization have offices in other regions or in other countries or in other contexts, because the diversity that you defined within your organization can be also different in other contexts. So the pre-work of measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion is to think about all these criteria. So low compliance, the question of trust, why do you do that, and how you communicate about that, and especially to define very clearly the purpose of measuring. Ninke, can you pass this next slide, please? Thank you. So basically, again, it depends all of your DEI strategy. There is no, one way to measure. Of course, it depends again on your strategy and the size of your organization and the type of your organization. But we can also give you some directions. And I think this DEI strategy learning trajectory, we already a little bit predefined like the kind of outcomes that you can achieve within your DEI strategy. I don't know if you remember, the theory of change, why we do DEI strategies and what are the possible outcomes. So if you haven't for the moment a DEI strategy or haven't thought, about measuring DEI, here are some outcomes that you can use to define, DEI outcomes to reach and indicators. So for instance, now we are focusing on outcome 3, which is DEI targets are well measured and monitored, because this is all about it in this workshop. And we have set like some indicators, so 5 indicators, which are, for instance, does your organization have set clear targets, goals, and indicators to measure the progress and diversity in your organization? Or does your organization have system in place to measure different diversity levels at the level of hiring or promotion or exit beyond, the demographics of only gender, age, or nationality? Does your organization share publicly data on the diversity composition of the workforce and compensation levels? So there's a lot of indicators that you can find back into the baseline assessment that we shared you in the beginning of the year. I think it was the beginning of the year. And inspire you on this kind of outcomes from the baseline that we propose you as organization in the beginning of this trajectory. But you can also, of course, define your own outcomes and indicators. We will in the end of the year, also measure, based on your answers, which is also a baseline of this learning trajectory, to come back as an evaluation to see how your organization reached certain levels based on these outcomes. And then we will come back and make a little benchmark between the organization present here. So that's also a little bit the purpose of this DEI assessment framework. We can pass on the following slide, please. Yeah. That's for the introduction. For the part 2, we will go a little bit more about different ways to measure diversity, inclusion, and equity, and especially to see the different methods. There are some questions here. How do you define underrepresentation? You mean underrepresented group? I see a comment of Marcello into the chat. We did actually spoke about intersectionality and different diversity dimensions. And again, it's really depending and variable on the context, but we had different discussions. I don't know if it was recorded, Gigi, maybe you can.
The previous session wasn't recorded because we had a lot of,
Oh yeah, okay.
Internal discussions and conversations. I'm not sure if we made a definition of underrepresented, but we were focusing on underrepresented groups and communities that are historically or in other forms placed in a marginalized position. And a variety of different groups were mentioned in.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we could share some of the we could share the resources that were shared in the previous module, if that's necessary.
Thank you very much, Gigi. I hope we did answer your question, Marcello. But beyond this introduction, so in conclusion, we can measure diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the most important thing is to know where are we as an organization. Because if you don't know where we are, what kind of diversity we want to measure, and what is the state of the current state of the organization, you cannot measure progress. So that's why we are now focusing a little bit more about the baseline assessment or the zero metric or the point of starting measuring. And for that, actually, we noticed by sending a survey that actually a lot of organizations here present already did this kind of assessments or audits, and which are really different from each other because it's tailor-made from the organization. And so we propose you to share your experiences based on the people who have already experienced and people who doesn't have already the experience, and to engage in the discussion about how to conduct and to start a baseline assessment. And for that, we invite Marleen Speaker from SOA, Nicolette Matthijssen from Oxfam Novit, Jona Turalde from Choice, Carol Frampton from Peace Next Foundation, and Laura Bernat from WECF. Maybe to explain very shortly about what kind of assessment you did, and after we will randomly split the breakout rooms so that you can enter in discussion into small groups. Marleen, can I invite you really briefly to say what you will speak about?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So basically within ZOA, we did an assessment task by our management team in the Netherlands to get a better understanding of what the current status is of GDI within ZOA, because we basically had a gender policy and our management team wanted to explore opportunities to broaden the scope to also include diversity and inclusion. And as a humanitarian organization, we work across, I think, about 15 different countries. So, context different, so status of those aspects different as well. So we did it really low key, like we did qualitative interviews with staff members across the different countries, and we used former data which came from surveys with gender focal points to basically inform the assessment, and then to go back to our management team to basically provide them with some advice on how to move forward.
Thank you very much, Marlene. I think you can also share a little bit more in the breakout rooms, but thank you for presenting it. Nicolette, do you want to have a few words really shortly about what you did at the Oxfam Novib?
So we established the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Committee, and the committee said, if our task is amongst others to monitor how we're doing to improve on DEI, it's important to know what a baseline is. So we invited an external consultant to assess our policies and practices in Oxfam Novib, the office in The Hague.
Okay, thank you, Nicolette. Jona from Choice, can you have a few words about your survey?
Thank you, Nina. Hello, everyone. So for Choice, we had initially an anti-racism working group, and then that branched out as a diversity, equity, inclusion working group. And then we hired a consultant to really have our initial DEI strategy, and that strategy talked about the ones listed here, a survey within Choice, our governance structure, and really understanding our goals within our DEI process.
Thank you very much, Jona. Carol from Peace Nexus Foundation.
Thank you. Yeah, so we had a sort of quite extensive organizational review that comprised programmatic reviews, but also an organizational one. But they were limited space with a lot of questions to ask on all aspects of the organization. So there was only one question that focused on sort of experience of exclusion or inclusion, but that was enough to sort of already break it down and what are the actual areas where work is being done. We're now developing a program retreat for to address those very specific issues that have come out. And I can also speak a little bit more about the work I do supporting organization in implementing a D&I agenda as a donor.
Thank you very much. Laura, you want to tell about your assessment?
So for us, that's an ongoing thing. It has barely started, but basically it's an anonymous survey we want to do with all staff in the WCF and also the board. And it's to establish this baseline assessments. And so, as you can see here, some of the questions that we asked was how they see DEI in the WCF so far. Are they happy with it? How they see equity? But also there were some questions about privilege awareness, also the work-life balance, work boundaries. And so we hope to that participating in this trajectory by Partos will give us guidance for the next steps.
Okay. Thank you very much for you for your presentation, and I'm willing to share also a little bit more in small groups. So now we will have 15 minutes in the breakout rooms to engage the discussion. Also, maybe other people want to share their experiences too. So we see each other again in plenary within 15 minutes. Ninka, are you ready? Okay.
Can people see the breakout rooms now? I think I see people moving. Otherwise, you can see it in the in your screen.
You have to click on breakout room.
Yeah, go to options and then breakout room. If people are struggling, I can move them there too. But you should have the option now on your Zoom.
But I shouldn't. Oh, sorry. Hello.
Yes.
I was in the middle of talking to the other. Okay, never mind. Sorry.
And Ninka, they are they're not automatically referred to one of the spaces, right? Because right now choice has just one participant.
Oh.
Oh, people can choose.
Yeah, so perhaps we can ask people from.
I can jump over to choice. Ciao.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Bye bye.
Yeah, the same is for
Okay,
WECF, I see.
it's okay, the divide, huh?
Oh no.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
Okay.
We can always jump into those rooms as well. Okay, so they're still recording. We're still recording this session.
Ah, yeah. Okay. So
Is it pause it, Ninka?
welcome back, everybody. We just forgot to ask consent because we are recording this session. So if you are not agree, please tell it us. But we are recording this session in the purpose to keep track on what we discuss and also to share it to the participants who are not here.
The only exception is that the Q&A with the racial equity index and the equity index is going to be shared online as well. So,
okay, that's a good one. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Gigi. So welcome back. We will keep on. There's no comeback of what you discussed. I hope you learned something and you will have also another opportunity to share further about your experience around baseline assessments. But we are getting immediately into the second part, which is giving you really an introduction about how to measure diversity and inclusion and equity, actually. For that, we will have a couple of minutes and you will have also a little space to ask questions if you want to. So can you go on the next slide, please, Ninka?
Do you see my slides?
Yeah.
Or did I?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So, well, as you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a huge topic, and there are multiple types of measuring and ways to report on different identity aspects and social aspects, which is also, again, very different from the context to another. So what we want actually to explain is that whatever it is quantitative data or qualitative data, you need to take into consideration the aspects of one side, so the different data demographics that you have defined, whether it is age, gender, nationality, but also religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability. So you have first to define which kind of demographics you want to measure. So data demographics, and on the other side, what you want to measure. So is it like the progression of different type of identities within the hiring procedure? Is it about the feeling of being included? Is it about exit of different kind of people? So you have to think about these two variables. So one side, the demographics, and on the other side, what you want to measure. So about diversity, it's a little bit more, and we will speak after about the different methods that you can use to measure. So it would be like based on HR analytics, conducting surveys, interviews, focus groups, the employee satisfaction survey, or existing benchmark or indexes. So what method you want to use is actually linked to what you want to measure. So about diversity, actually, when you have your different demographics that you want to measure progress on, you have to measure to see what you can actually measure. And here on this slide, you have some entry points that you could measure depending on your strategy. So I will go very fast about that because then you can read it with the, taking some time when you will get the presentation, but basically you can measure the way people are represented within your organization. I said again, minority groups in comparison with the majority groups, you want to have more of this type of people into different layers of your organization, so you can use to quantify diversity to measure the representation in your organization. Another aspect which is also very known is how do you ensure that you are having an inclusive recruitment policy, and if you actually attract people from different groups of different backgrounds. So that could be a focus of your measuring system. It can be also focusing on the selection part, like is there at this point of the recruitment also a bias that might, affect underrepresented groups? It can be also the retention point to see if certain underrepresented groups are leaving more than other majority groups. You can focus on promotion, pay, and development. I put that in the same way, but are there certain types of people who get easier promotion or get to have more pay or more pay rise than other people, or have more opportunities to develop within the organization and to change positions? So that's important to measure that, to see if there are some people, also employees from different or minorized or underrepresented groups who are affected by this kind of aspects. And then, so that is a little bit like the hardcore data that you can get of HR analytics. If you have defined, this, what I said, this demographic data that you want to gather. But then slightly, you can also apply these quantitative methods also on, for instance, employee engagement, which is also slightly going into the direction of the feeling of inclusion. You can, and from the level of employee engagement means the level of enthusiasm and dedication that employees feels to work towards their employees into the workplace. How to measure? So the next slide, please. Inclusion is a little bit more tricky, of course, because it's less about hard data. It relies on, of course, different experiences and feelings of employees, but it has as most importance than the other hard data that we explain about. You can measure the feeling of inclusion by different methods. And one which is very, very known is the job satisfaction measuring that you have. Probably your organization is conducted this kind of measurement, which is an employee satisfaction survey that is sent maybe every 1-2 years. And one of you also explained that you can integrate a question which is linked to the feeling of inclusion. You can ask your employees during this, annual or biannual survey questions about the level of engagement, the level of well-being of certain people, the level of safety of certain people, and the level of growth. I cannot go into detail, but you can have a lot of questions that you can add to this, basic employee satisfaction surveys that are done in big organizations, especially. But that is one way to measure one feeling of inclusion. Another way to measure inclusion can be, of course, also conducting more qualitative, measurement by conducting focus groups or interviews of certain people. I have done that, for instance, at my organization, to make an open call and anonymously to send an external external consultant to conduct, in-depth interviews with some people who identified as part of underrepresented groups, and there you can gather a lot of information about the feeling or not of inclusion. And based on that, you can also, sharpen your DI strategy, but that would be less representative, of course, than the hardcore data that you gather on the diversity part. But that could be a way to have information about the feeling of inclusion. Another way is also to analyze actually the exit interview questions, because mostly people who are leaving your organization can also be ready to say more about the reasons why they left, and if there is an aspect of discrimination or exclusion or something like based on the age, race, gender, sexual identity, people can feel more free if they want to share about the reasons of their leaving. It doesn't mean that everybody's leaving is leaving for this reason, but it can be a very important source of information. And I didn't know that, but and I don't know if your organizations also have this kind of interviews, but you can also conduct, instead of exit interviews, you can conduct like stay interviews. It means so having, your annual discussion with your how do you say leidinggevende, leader, the person who is like evaluating your work. You can also ask this kind of question of how do you feel like in the organization? What can be improved, and what is the value of this organization? And you can also have this kind of conversations also with your employees. It can be monthly, it can be annually. So that are the information sources that you can get. Probably there are other ways to gather information about the inclusion feeling. And Mariella will especially go into detail about how they did it in their organization. But that's basically a bit the ways you can measure diversity and inclusion. I see one comment of Nicolette in the chat. Ah, interesting. Okay. Okay, so thank you for sharing this information. Indeed, the Charter Diversiteit in Bedrijf, which is a Dutch organization, and some organization of you also signed this charter, but they have also very relevant documents, and especially one that you will find also in resources, which is called in Dutch meten is weten, so measuring is knowing in which direction you are going. And so apparently, Nicolette, you said that there is a document about exit interviews and how to use it to measure diversity and inclusion, right? Okay, thank you. Now I'm done a little bit more about the basics about how to measure diversity and inclusion. Do you have at this point any questions that pops up? No question at this point. Okay, that's okay, good. Feel free also that, thank you, Laura, that you, yes, Rohit, you can also speak if you want to add.
Thank you, Nina. I was writing because my video is not working. There's a discussion going on within our D&I working group at COC that we want to do, we want to measure. And should we do it ourselves, the baseline, or should that always be an external party? Because you're doing your own measurement. Is it allowed? Can you give your thoughts on that?
Wow, I think it's a question of choice, and then I'm really also happy to hear the different, because I know people have done different ways. But my first question would be what you want to measure, because if you want, you know, a neutral view or something like an external consultant conducting a baseline assessment, you are anyways also guiding the assessment purpose. So in this way, I think, you know, total neutrality or objectivity about DEI is actually is quite impossible. So it depends what you want to get from this baseline assessment. If the level of trust, for instance, in your organization is low, then I would advise, you know, to go to an external consultant, because then there is no, you know, relationship between, you know, employees, yeah, and like this power dynamics, or even, you know, the lack of trust.
Yeah.
But if the level of trust is good in your organization, then you can conduct yourself your assessment and be much more specific into what you are looking for. So that would be my answer on this question. But I see that. Yeah, did I answer? Okay.
Sure. Thanks.
You're welcome. Anna, you wanted to react on that?
Yeah, I wanted to just share how we did at WSF, because we do not have any kind of funding for this kind of core work. And therefore, we don't have the funding to outsource it to an external person at this point. But we're hoping with a survey and commitments, I mean, we'll be able to mobilize some funding for it. And the way we've done it so far is that we have a biannual strategy meetings across all our offices. And then at the last one, there was a lot of calls for a strategy on this specifically. And then there was a group set up. And then there was a lot of other things mentioned at the strategy that we took those questions and turned that into a survey. And we have a DEI, but we have a lot of trust in our organization. So I think that relates to what you were saying as well. But we've had several people look at the survey. We've also, the management is not part of creating the survey, right? Because we want to be a safe space. But we have sent it to management so that we have them as allies in this, because we were talking about stakeholders and mapping stakeholders before in the first one. So we don't want to show something at the end that they won't implement. I don't think they would ever not implement it, but you never know. But then in terms of the questions, the way we did it, because yeah, we're obviously working there, and then that will guide some of the input we are creating. It is very hard for us to make it a completely anonymous survey, because some of the identity markers are very visible, some are not. And then what we've said and what we clarified in our survey is that obviously,
sorry, I have to, not that I want to interrupt you, but I think it's important to know that we will have also the discussion within the session into our walking room. Not that I want, but we have a kind of strict planning.
No, I understand.
And I really thank you for sharing that, because you said also very important elements into that, which is involving especially the management within, you know, if you are creating your own survey, and especially when you are involving, for instance, the DEI committee, you know, making a questionnaire is really important. That's also a very good way that you shared. So thank you. That also gives also idea to people. And especially also to involve the management is one of the most important points. And again, when it's a small organization, I don't know about to keep, you know, anonymity and to protect individuals into, you know, sharing personal information. You need, that's why I think, but that is really my opinion, when you are a small organization, it's interesting also to have an external, you know, point of view, because otherwise you will, you know, have information about people because there is not so much people, so you can guess. Or you have a committee within the committee, which is, you know, ensuring that it's anonymously enough and that you protect, you know, the revelations or what people are saying. So it's a big debate. So that's why I'm closing it, because otherwise everybody can share, and we will have again a walk-in session with external consultants, which will also explain their approaches, because there are many of them and many interesting ones. And we will also give the space to especially small organizations to share about their experiences about own assessments. So sorry, Anna, if I needed to interrupt you. We will go on now on Mariella. So speaking about, the practical aspect of that, I think Mariella has a lot also to share about their experience. So could you, yeah, Mariella, the floor is yours. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's very, it goes in line with the practices that Hannah is implementing, as well as the question of Rohit. So I'm going to share a bit. So we create our own baseline for setting up the priorities and identifying setting up a strategy, a DEI strategy. So if we go to our next slide, I show you a bit how was the process. So we start with the pre-survey. So we created a DEI working group in 2021. We started with 6 members, now we are 4. And the steps were to set up a pre-survey that was kind of a baseline, where we kind of create the DEI baseline and we focus on knowledge, skills, and attitude. So we ask a couple of questions about the knowledge. What is the understanding about DEI? What is diversity? What is inclusion? What is equity for them? So that we understand, kind of know, is it really, because there were many ideas about what DEI was. So we needed to first start working on what exactly is DEI. And then also we look at the skills and the attitudes towards certain issues in the organization. And this is how we kind of, once we create this baseline, we analyze the data. And based on the data that we receive, we set up a kind of an strategy for the organization, for the DEI working group. So we are a group of volunteers, a group of employees. There is not an employee. It's not an employee resource group. It's more like a committee, similar to the practice that Nicolette was talking about Oxfam. And what we saw, we identified like 3 key areas to work with was because of the organization was in a process of change, that we need to focus first on the alignment of what DEI is, because based on that, we understood that the knowledge about DEI was not equal to all of the employees in the organization. So that was one first. So we need to focus on alignment about what DEI is and what the DEI working group was going to do about. Then there was also an issue of safety, because there was so much change around that we need to build again the group in the sense of feel safe and have this environment of trust. So, and it's a very diverse group. So we needed to really focus on our own identities and diversity. So the second priority was about creating a psychological safe working environment. And this is one of the elements of engagement, right? That Nina was talking about. The safety plus is one of the 3 elements of engagement. So it was very important to focus about that. And the third one was we focus on the issue of inclusion. So we had to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity, the demographics are there, but the inclusion aspect is, and I don't know, media, what is more relevant at the moment. And of course, equity is a beautiful dream to achieve. But I think if we don't manage first the second part, that is the inclusion aspect, mainly to make sure everybody feel heard, seen, and valued, then moving to equity is, yeah, I see it more like a role to that. So our focus was to focus on inclusion. And what happened was we integrate the DEI strategy. A KPI was established, and this KPI was integrated in the strategic objectives of organizations. So as part of the strategic objectives, we have 5. One of them is about inclusive and inspiring working environment. And we kind of managed to have one KPI from DEI. This is important because it means that when we talk with the leadership team and we talk with the CEO and with the supervisory board, we are reporting about this KPI on DEI that was based on the baseline that we create, and we kind of share the progress every quarter about this. And we see the progression about how once we measure and we identify the needs, so what action plan are we doing in order to make some progress or advance DEI in the organization. So after that, we implement the DEI action plan. So based on the baseline, we set up an action plan for the year. And this is the action plan of the DEI working group. And we focus on these 4 areas, on focusing on the team, on focusing on our learning and digital products, R&D media trainers and partners. So basically what we try to apply DEI, not only from a human resource point of view at our team as employees, but also try to see a bit more behind about how can we advance DEI with our partners or with our network, or when we are developing our digital or learning products. And this is interesting because it means that we collaborate with other project leads who are not in the DEI working group in order to advance DEI behind the R&D media team. And as a result, we delivered like 10 learning sessions on DEI. And so for instance, something that we are a good practice that work very well is that we do like an inclusive onboarding session, which means that we invite the new employees, and the DEI working group does an onboarding session with the areas related to safety and inclusion. Like one question is, one activity that we do is, what do you need to feel included? What do you need to feel included is, and people answer, what do they need to feel included? So we are trying to have these conversations and looking at the different identities or diversities that each of us have in order to try to build a safe environment. And for instance, the onboarding sessions, we invite, for instance, one person of the leadership team to also be there, so that you can also get to know a person from the leadership team from a different perspective in terms of DEI. So we also focus on unconscious bias, on inclusive leadership sessions, because all of the 2 relate to the feeling of inclusion, right? So some of the skills that needs to be there for the project leads, for all the employees, also for the management, in order to have inclusive conversations. And then also we also try to look for pulse checks, which means at the end of these sessions, we look at, we try to focus on the voices. So one thing is the data. So you will get data through the employee engagement survey, you will get data in the baselines, but also a way of getting the data, or I would say the employee sentiment associated to a situation, is to hear the voices. And what I mean the voices is like when we do an EDI onboarding session or when we do an inclusive leadership workshop, we always try to end up with a couple of open questions. And it's interesting because, for instance, in the unconscious bias session that we have in November, we ask like an open question about, how will you apply this? Or what do you need from us as an EDI working group? So it was a very open question. What do you need from us? How can we help you to advance DEI? It was a very open question from one of us in a Menti meeting. And then you see all the voices. And then you can recognize in the voices and the way how certain things are expressed that an issue of power dynamics still needs to be addressed, and it was not still addressed properly. An issue of inclusive leadership still needs to be addressed. So that helps you to kind of reflect, okay, so I got this data and the baseline, and I also have the strategy in place, we run these workshops and also we do this pulse check, but also heading from a more informal way, what is the employee sentiment associated to certain issues, is for us as a DEI working group a way to say like, okay, we also need to focus on this, right? Of course, we cannot always, yes?
Mariela, and just it's absolutely interesting, but I know you have another slide and we have 2 minutes less, so
okay,
it's for your the time.
Yes, that's fine. So just wanted to, then we focus in the post survey, and then we look back again to the skills, knowledge, and attitude, and that is how we kind of track. Was it a change through any of these activities that we have done? So if we go to the next slide, we will see that when we create so the KPI is this: we at Rentable Media increase DEI as an organizational priority in all our capacities. So this is embedded into the strategic objective of the organization. And then we have after the baseline, we create this target like 80% participation and 60% increase of understanding. So this is what we wanted to achieve. And what happened in December, that we kind of used the same survey to see what was the change. And what we got is like 68 increased understanding on DEI with the 75 activities implemented. So this is a way of kind of this how we report back to the supervisory board and to the leadership team about our DEI progress. And I would say when you get data, and this is like the message to you all, is not only about reporting to our supervisory board, which is important, or our organizational, but it's also as a DEI practitioner, we need to build the trust with our employees, right? And when we hear these voices of a sentiment associated to a situation, we also need to report back to all the employees, to our Rentable Media team, which means that in the stand-up sessions or when there are moments to communicate to the whole organization, it's important to acknowledge, we as a DEI working group, this is what we are doing, this is what we heard from you, that these are the issues, and this is what we are responding to these issues through this action plan of this year that we are going to be focusing, and then these are the priorities. Of course, we always need to choose, because of course we have limited resources, which means that there might be a lot of issues to work with, but at the end of the day, as a DEI working group, the way how in Rentable Media we are working on is trying to identify, okay, what are the key areas that are urgent and important, where we can really advance DEI, and this is what we try to report and also connect and communicate with the employees as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariela. And I'm really impressed about the results that you achieved within even less than a year. And I mean, this percentage are also so much speaking about the progress. And I don't know if we reach 100% to the results, but also the diversification of a trainers pool is really impressing within such a short time. So really thank you, Mariela, for your inspiration and for sharing this during this workshop. I want also to add that you will have also a session, a walk-in session where you have much more time, to go into details about how you conducted this assessment, and that would be on the 25th of April, but Gigi will tell you more about that. But for now, really, thank you, Mariela, for sharing that with us. So now we are going to the last part of this workshop, and we actually, the thing is like how to measure equity is maybe a bit broad, because what you said, Mariela, is more like an outcome of where we are going down, something that you can really measure. But we have very interested guests here, and I pass the word to Gigi, who will facilitate this panel discussion.
Yes, of course. Can we move on to the next slide? Because before I lose you all after the Q&A, I just wanted to highlight the next steps of the DEI learning trajectory that are part of this module. This will also be shared by email, but what is nice to know is that on the 25th of April, we'll have a Q&A session with different consultants that have a very active track record in DEI monitoring and evaluation. So Mariela will also be one of the presenters during this Q&A session, so save the date. Then on the 11th of May, the Racial Equity Index that we've also invited for this session will hold an informational session where you can participate as an organization to learn more about what it means to take an organizational assessment. And of course, after that, there will be an option to take that assessment as well with the guidance of the Racial Equity Index. And then on the 24th of May, there's a walk-in session where you can again exchange with your peers. And last, we hope to organize, and this is still tentative, but we will soon confirm a in-person event here in the Netherlands for the people that are able to join us, which will be a surprise symposium, but it will be related to the topic of DEI. So that's about the next steps. And now we move on to our panel discussion. Can we move on to the next slide as well? Okay. So welcome also for the people that are watching this session later on. This is part of the Partos DEI learning trajectory that we have started this year. Today we're starting with the module on monitoring and measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as part of this module, we've invited two speakers to tell more about what it means to measure equity. How do you index it? And we've invited Arisha and Uma from two organizations that have similar names, but we'll explore it later, but a very specific focus on equity in international development. Are you here, Arisha and Uma?
Yes. Hi, Gigi.
Hi, welcome. So today we are going to have a conversation about what we actually mean with equity in international development. And these are two initiatives that have been accelerating and advocating for more equity in international development. And we would like to invite you to explain a little bit more about your motivation, but also what specific steps you could take as an organization if you want to raise your accountability and work on equity. So we're going to start with asking you to quickly pitch what the equity index is and what the racial equity index is. And after that, we'll have a couple of questions, but also open the floor to the different participants to share your perspectives. Yeah, so can I start with Arisha? I believe we have some slides that she prepared as well.
Yeah, would you be able to share your screen? Otherwise I can.
I think we have them here, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Some work in progress behind the scenes. In the meantime, you can already start introducing who you are as well.
Sure. Sounds good. Great, thanks so much. Great, hi everyone, can you hear me all right? Yeah. Great. So I'm Arisha, and I'm a policy and research associate with the advocacy team. So we are a political consultancy based in London. We support clients with their advocacy campaigns and research, and we center equity within all the work that we do. And as part of my work, I support on the equity index as well. So I was very much involved in the pilot phase of the equity index, sort of the public data mapping, for instance. And I've also continued to be involved in the work that's kind of been ongoing with the equity index as well. And the link there is the director of the advocacy team, Lorianne Robinson, is also the co-founder of the equity index as well. So our work kind of interlinks in that respect. So I'll just quickly kind of talk through our story and kind of what we do and sort of our mission, just as a brief overview. Thanks. So the idea for the equity index kind of emerged in 2019 when our co-founders, Alex Martins and Lorianne Robinson, sort of talked through the idea of a public index that would sort of encourage the Northern international development sector to sort of turn inwards and focus as much as on its own practices and behaviors and its work in the global South as well. And so the idea is sort of slowly developed throughout 2019, and it was shared with a wide range of people from across the development sector, both Southern and Northern as well. And in March of 2020, a diverse group of international development experts also came together, and they sort of formed an official advisory council that helped advise on the work of the Equity Index. So the Equity Index officially became a community interest company in May 2020, and it was launched publicly in June 2020 after receiving our first grant from the Joffrey Charitable Trust. So kind of more broadly, the Equity Index is basically a UK social enterprise, and we advocate for greater equity across the international development sector. And we will measure and track multiple dimensions of equity in the internal and external workings of the UK development organizations to influence meaningful change in their policies, practices, and partnerships. So this includes racial and gender equity, equity in knowledge production, in funding, in collaboration, and more. And we believe measuring equity at the organizational level in an open and transparent way will raise awareness about the negative consequences of inequity, including the fact that development interventions are less likely to be effective and sustainable over the long term. So we basically aim to foster a race to the top rather than a race to sort of stay away from the bottom. So in the next slide, I'll just touch on our pilot for the Equity Index. So between July 2020 and June 2021, we embarked on a pilot project using this £20,000 grant from the Joffrey Trust to conduct a pilot project with a focus on the UK development consultancy sector. And this ranged from small consultancies to larger corporate companies as well. And our overarching goal there was to demonstrate a new and impactful way of measuring equitable practice within and across development organizations. So this pilot provided an opportunity for the Equity Index to basically test a core part of our theory of change, and that was that creating and measuring a sample of organizations against internal and external equity indicators, when combined with advocacy efforts across the sector, will lead to organizational shifts and broader cultural change in the development sector. And I'll touch on those indicators a bit when the discussion gets to that point. So this work basically included background research. So we did a comparative mapping of existing indices and a briefing note outlining key definitions of equity that we found, which are all available on our website. And we also developed an indicator assessment framework, including an overview of resources for each indicator. We tested the indicators with pilot organizations. We did a mapping of public equity related data sources, and then we publicly launched the pilot results through a virtual event. And we also culminated all the learnings from that into a report that's also available on our website. And so our pilot basically focused on development consultancies, and it was based solely on publicly available data. But the core activity of the Equity Index moving forward, when we've secured the funding we need, it will sort of look at development and regular updating of an index that measures how equitable UK international development organizations are internally and in their work with the Global South. And we'll look at organizational policies, practices, and partnerships. And we'll look at different actors within the sector. So just beyond consultancies, we would look at bilateral government donors, foundations, INGOs and NGOs, and other civil society actors, private sector consultancies and corporate actors, and research institutions like think tanks and universities, just to name a few. So the goal is to look at all these different actors and assess them independently. If we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the vast majority from then on now has been mostly pro bono. So since 2022, we've been focused on just fundraising and delivering on some exciting projects as well. So we have engaged in partnerships through a more consultancy approach. And these are with organizations in the global development sector based on the UK, either Global North or Global South, and organizations both in and outside of the UK as well in other sectors. So for instance, investment, corporate, education, engineering, and more. And these partnerships have been fascinating because we've had the opportunity to put the learning into practice. So for instance, in 2022, we partnered with development impact managers and advisors called DEMA, And we helped design materials on racial and gender equity in the Brazilian context. And this was put together as a guide on equity for Brazilian startups in Portuguese. So that was just one example of one of these partnerships. And aside from that, we've published resources such as the discussion paper on positive action. We've explored equity and UK equality law to explore the potential for the current positive action legal framework in the UK to promote greater equity in the global development sector. That's also available on our website. And we've supported the International Development Committee's inquiry on racism in the aid sector in the UK through oral evidence and written evidence as well. So that was just sort of a snapshot of who we are and kind of the work that we've done up until now. Thank you.
Gigi, we don't hear you.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. Can we invite Uma to present the Racial Equity Index?
Yes, I'm just going to share my screen on my end. So hi, everyone. My name is Uma. I am a senior consultant with a Better Org, but also the initiator and the facilitator of the Racial Equity Index. And my pronouns are she, her. This is just a brief overview, and it's going to be a lot of information in a very concentrated period of time in terms of our work at the Racial Equity Index and what we are doing. We are a group of BIPOC volunteers. We have up until this point received very minimal funding for our work, but we started as a collective of BIPOC development practitioners that are globally located in the global majority and also within the global north, because we have all experienced racism within global development. So I want you to hold that in mind as we're moving through what we're trying to do at the Racial Equity Index. We are a group of people who have been impacted by really harmful and inequitable practices within global development organizations. And so the creation of what we're doing within the Racial Equity Index stems very much and is rooted very much from our lived experience. So we're building an index, we're building specifically an index focused on racial equity to hold the global development sector fully accountable for dismantling. Our team is incredible, and our collective is amazing and globally located. I should also add that we are completely peer reviewed, because again, anytime you do work rooted around discussions of racial justice and racial equity, it's very hyper analyzed and criticized in many respects. So our peer reviewers are also from the global majority and are really experienced academics and also global development practitioners. And so everything that you see in terms of our reports and what we are producing is heavily peer reviewed for multiple reasons. We have been on a journey since July of 2020, when everything kind of was cracked open within the global development sector. We started by launching a global mapping survey, specifically targeting, again, people within the sector. We want to hold organizations accountable, but ultimately organizations are made up of the people that work within them. So our target audience for this index is the people who work in global development, and specifically the people who are impacted by racial violence within global development organizations and by lack of inclusion and by lack of diversity in global development organizations. So all of what you see in terms of what we are building and launching next year is informed by the research that was gathered within the global mapping survey. We translated the survey in 10 languages. We received responses from over 80 countries, and we were able to mine the data to build what we call our index. I'm just going to go through a little bit in terms of our indicators and then what we're trying to do here. So we have created, based on this research for the global mapping survey, everything's on our website as well in terms of the results from that and the qualitative and quantitative data. We've developed 11 indicators to measure racial inequity within organizations. And we're talking about funders, development practitioners, consultancies, whoever works within the global development sector at large. And these indicators allow us to explore racial inequity broadly across an organization. These indicators include workplace culture, mission, salary, fund allocations, grant-making principles, leadership, So a lot of different areas where we see racial inequity popping up, and that can be layered or it can be, broadly located within each of those indicators. Each of these indicators has significant work around it in terms of the definitions and how we talk about racial inequity within each indicator. So we have 11 indicators of racial equity. We're probably going to add another one or a couple more as we continue to do our research. But within each indicator, what we have also done is create subcodes that allow us to not only now look at racial equity broadly, but also now with depth within each of the indicators. So for example, when we talk about a workplace culture that has an environment where racial equity is thriving, that means that there is less racial abuse, less prioritization of white voices, less gaslighting and tokenism. And so we're able to really create subcodes, or we have created subcodes specific to each indicator that allow us to really kind of tease out the environment that either houses racial inequity or promotes racial equity within an organization. The last thing that I'll say is that a lot of the work that we've been doing is very much behind the scenes because the sector isn't ready to have this level of transparency around racial equity fully out there. Right. And so we have a learning partnership with the Better Org. And within that learning partnership, we've been able to work with organizations to use the Racial Equity Index as part of their measurement tool in terms of assessing where they are on racial equity measures. The final thing that I will say is a lot of some interesting feedback that we receive when we talk about racial equity and specifically focusing on racial equity is, well, what about the other forms of oppression? And what I find really interesting about that is that because we're focusing on racial equity, we immediately are also focusing on the most layered forms of oppression that we find within organizations. So we are extremely intersectional in our approach because we recognize that when we're talking, for example, about disability rights, we know that those that identify as Black and disabled face the highest levels of oppression and marginalization. So just because we are called the Racial Equity Index doesn't mean we're not weaving in intersecting forms of oppression in our approach. I will pause there.
Okay, can we have an applause for both of the speakers? Thank you. I'm very curious because after hearing your presentation, I also understood that you have been in contact before. What are some of the similarities, but also some of the differences that you see between the two indexes? Perhaps Arisha, you would like to start.
I mean, I think in terms of similarities, we're both very much focused on accountability and sort of ensuring that within the sector. And I think that's something we've talked about is, if you look in the private sector, for instance, there are multiple indexes measuring DEI. And so we're thinking, why is our sector should be subject to the same level of scrutiny. So we think it's a good thing to have multiple indexes kind of focusing on equity. And the more initiatives we have within the ecosystem, I think the better. Yeah.
Yeah. How's that for you, Ilma?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, when we say this within the Racial Equity Index for a sector that loves data, there certainly is very limited data in a very transparent way around racial equity or equity in general within global development organizations. And so, as Arisha said, the more light that we can shine on what is actually happening behind closed doors within organizations, the greater room we give to having very open discussions around racial equity and equity in general, but then also the challenges that organizations face in committing to and also moving through the journey that DEI inclusion efforts and racial equity requires.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's really inspiring to see that. I think and these initiatives, they also come from people that, as you explained, they come from people that are from, for example, in the case of Racial Equity Index, all people from BIPOC backgrounds, and they take this initiative forward and to actually bring it more, make it more accessible, but also open and possible to have these conversations. What I was wondering in creating these processes, and you already alluded a little bit about how, for example, these 11 indicators were developed, but also the pilot that Arisha mentioned in the equity index. What has been the process of developing such an index? Who do you invite? What steps do you take? Because it seems like a huge project.
Yeah, I can go first on that. So in terms of, for the pilot itself, I think it was a shared effort with the advisory council. I think it was culminated with a group of individuals who are also experts within this area, and they kind of fed into the development of the index too. But that is something that we acknowledged that we weren't able to integrate enough, I think, global South voices within the pilot index. And that's something we definitely want to be able to incorporate in the actual full index when we are able to sort of do that with the post fundraising. So in terms of considerations, I think I can jump into indicators now if that's helpful, just to touch on that. So when we were developing the pilot index to try and kind of make sure that we were taking a proper intersectional approach, I think we had horizontal indicators and vertical indicators that we included in the pilot, and we intend to keep that for the actual index as well, the full one. So horizontal indicators sort of represented baseline equity standards applicable to all organizations. And then vertical indicators were more specific. So they sort of captured different types of organizations in the sector. That might include ODA spending government departments, nonprofit organizations, private sectors, et cetera. So they'll sort of be tailored more towards that. Yeah. And so that's something we kind of considered in the consideration of developing the pilot and the full index as well. And overall, we had some principles as well that kind of guided the development of that framework. And that was intersectionality, capturing a combination of policy and practice, having more qualitative than quantitative sort of in nature of the information, because we feel like equity is quite a difficult thing to capture quantitatively a lot of the time. So we felt like qualitative information might be helpful in that, being realistic, but also ambitious. Presenting a reasonable reporting burden for organizations as well, and considering that, and trying to avoid a tick box approach to equity and sort of identifying entry points that can lead to meaningful change by sort of kickstarting a process. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. And for you, Uma.
Yeah, in our process of trying to really build the racial equity index, and we are very much in a build stage, because we will be releasing the first public version of the index next year, early next year, hopefully. It has very much been people-centered. So what I mean by that is that, you know, we have been doing a lot of work and intentional work around discussions around the data and how we analyze it, intentional work of how our own personal experiences are impacting how we see the data. You know, it's been an interesting experience for us because, again, because we have all experienced racism in global development, including our peer reviewers, and because our target audience is the people who work within global development, one of the things that we've had to really ingest and also hold is the weight that this work holds. We are building an index to hold global development organizations accountable for the harm that they cause to BIPOC communities. That's not an easy task. And what goes unnoticed more often than we talk about is that we talk about the benefits of DEI work, but we don't talk about the fact that that in the process of operationalizing DEI, people are still being impacted by inequitable practices. And so for us, the build of this index is very much rooted within how these experiences manifest, and also the psychological impact of it. We can't ignore it. We've had to take many days off in doing this work, just because some of the research that we've done has been really heavy, and it's been very hard to hold. And I want to encourage organizations to really think about the fact that there are people at the end of this work that you're doing, right? And so while we're trying to build the index to really build more accountability, we're doing so because this level of harm can't continue as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks for, I think, highlighting these different principles that are part of doing this work. So it's not just creating a set of indicators, it's really based on an entire process of understanding the values of how you would like to work. And I heard that intersectionality is something that is coming back strongly. At the same time, I really like the policy to practice approach that you mentioned as well, the qualitative and quantitative element. And it's, I think, also a very clear call to us as DEI practitioners that even though we're aiming to create more equitable spaces, in that process, if you're not aware of the forms of exclusion or oppression that you might perpetuate in your practices, that can also still be harmful. So I think it's really interesting to hear these perspectives. I had one small question, and then I also want to open it up to the other participants, and that is really about how organizations have received and worked with these different indexes. What has been the responses from organizations you've worked with? Are they open? Yeah. Perhaps for you, Uma, first.
Yeah, I will say that the organizations that we've worked with, we can't name, this is through our learning partnership with TBO, the Better Org, because they're a consultancy and we are all volunteers at the Racial Equity Index. And so for organizations that have worked with the Racial Equity Index, they have done so through the Better Org, and the Better Org has a license to use that, the tool that we've developed and we are developing. And you know, I think what's interesting about organizations that have utilized the index and have taken, you know, the index, one is highlighting of areas where they didn't think about racial equity or inequity existing. So what I mean by that is we have 11 indicators. A lot of times organizations aren't thinking about where the pockets of racial inequity could be hiding within their organizations. And so it's been interesting for us to really see how the indicators allow folks within organizations to really think about how each of these practices are not only playing out within each section, but then throughout the organization. I think the second piece of this is for us, you know, again, this is a learning partnership. It's an engagement that we do with organizations, really understanding how we can, because again, our target audience is the people that work within the organizations, not the HR departments, not the DEI leads, but the people. And so what are the questions that we need to be thinking about either adding to our index or indicators that we need to add to our index to make sure that we're truly being intersectional in our approach, you know, and so this is why I mentioned we may be adding 1 or 2 more indicators just based on the work we've done with organizations. And I think the third thing that's been really interesting to see is how the index is applicable to both very, you know, smaller organizations, so 50 people or less, and then larger organizations as well. And how we're able to parse out some of the data, you know, so that we can do an analysis that really speaks to what is happening within an organization. So it's been a really interesting experience for us, but definitely it is a journey.
Yeah. I agree with Uma. I think we've seen some similar stuff as well in terms of engaging with organizations. So a lot of our engagement, I think, was more within the pilot phase, because what we did was we used publicly available data and we sort of put it into a table, and we sort of said, here's what organizations do on a list of indicators. It was much more smaller in scale for that one, just because we were trying it out and we wanted to see how the indicators worked. And so what we did was, once we gathered the publicly available information and put it into that table, we went back to organizations and said, hey, this is what we found. Can you just wanted to double check if it's correct? And if there was anything you wanted to add to it as well, let us know, or anything you wanted to update. So I think from in those conversations that were differing responses, I think some organizations were much more enthusiastic about it. Some were a little bit nervous about what this would look like for them if they were included in the table. And so there was some nervousness there. There was some curiosity, I think, on certain indicators. For instance, some organizations, you know, they had questions about why this indicator, could you expand on why that would be, why you're measuring that, for instance. So I think it was an interesting learning process in that respect. But what was interesting was we tried to also hold space within that table. You know, we had a list of indicators, and sometimes it wasn't a hard yes or no on certain indicators. Some organizations will be doing work on that, but it wasn't obvious whether that would neatly fall into the indicators. So we tried to just include that extra context as well. And we allowed them to provide extra relevant information on certain indicators so that they could, yeah, it's one of those things that's it's a little bit difficult sometimes to completely neatly sort of fit into certain dimensions, sometimes equity. And so we allowed them the space to do that too, which I think they appreciated as well. So what was also quite interesting that came out of the pilot is we did a mix of consultancy sizes. And sort of there are different types of consultancies who, like McKinsey or KPMG, that they specialize in one area and they have a development branch. And then we had some organizations that were pure development organizations as well. And we found the more corporate consultancies performed better overall in the indicators, at least compared to pure development. And it's probably just because they're subject to more scrutiny based on the sector that they're based in. But again, it kind of just reinforced the point of, if they're being subject to that scrutiny, why can't we as a sector also do that? So that was also an interesting learning as well from it.
To the questions for the audience, I saw that Carol, you raised your hand. Are you able to?
Yep. Yeah. Thank you. That's very interesting. And as I work with INGOs on D&I processes, these kind of indexes are really helpful. What I come across though is that a lot of these inequities are sort of buried deep down in the HR practices of this organization, and the fact that especially those that have kind of grown over time and they've opened programs in different countries. And so to actually look at sort of salaries, benefits, contracts, status of all employers across multiple countries, across multiple labor laws, it becomes an enormous task. And with HR functions often underfunded, understaffed, and not necessarily also attracting the most competent or up-to-date individuals in the sector. So I was just wondering how, I mean, it's just such an enormous investment to even map what are the, I mean, it's crazy. They don't even know how they even pay their own employees, and comparing conditions is a huge job. Have you found sort of tools or methodologies, or when you have a big mess that is a result of years of colonial attitudes and unconscious sort of reactive practices, what can be helpful in trying to sort it out, knowing that also contracts are not easy to change?
Okay, that's a big question. Uma, would you like to take that on?
Sure. Carol, that is a very big question. There's a lot tied up in this question. And so I'm going to start from where I think every organization needs to start from. In any discussion around racial equity and racial justice, and really like resolving or trying to get to the root of where systemic inequities are presenting within an organization, I think just one of the things that needs to be named is the urgency culture and the white supremacy culture within the sector, and how this work is trying to be done in the raging river of program work and every other work that an organization is committing to. So when I hear an organization say, we don't have funds for HR, funds to do this work, well, do you have funds for something else? Can you redirect those funds? What are your priorities? What is your actual priority in rooting out inequity? And how much are you willing to dedicate time and resources to it? So that would be my first question, because this work can't happen, on top of everything else. There has to be room made for it. So there can be breath injected into it. There could be room to engage with it, because it's going to unsurface a lot of stuff, right? It's like the 400 years of colonial history and pain and everything that the global development sector sits on. That's not going to be upended by one external consultant coming in and doing a mapping of HR practices. It's going to take dedicated time and resources and years. And so that would be the very first thing that I would say. There's a lot of other thoughts I have.
Yeah, but I mean, we actually offer dedicated time and resources to do this work. And even with that, it's just, and it's organization who ask for the support, but it's just the mere volume of it is And yeah, it's a question of priorities. Yeah.
I want to give space for Orisha to reply as well, but I also want to know if there are any other questions in the room.
Yeah, I can jump in as well. I definitely agree with everything Uma said. I think that's like exactly spot on. And I think with that as well, I think something we have found, I mean, part of like what we're trying to do with the index is almost to put a little bit of pressure and say, here's what we found, even based on stuff like pay gap reporting, ethnicity reporting, and then, you know, you're putting organizations next to their peers, and the idea being that they can see what others are doing too, and hopefully that could push for some kind of meaningful change. But I think it's also exploring other avenues of pressure or to push for this. And one, for instance, would be, you know, here we have the International Development Committee, they had an inquiry on racism in the aid sector, which we provided evidence for. And through that, I think a report came out and we kind of emphasized the need for transparency, again, publishing your data, prioritizing this work. And so I think if the government potentially can take this seriously too, then that's also another avenue. It's just kind of helping to shift the mindsets of different actors within the ecosystem, and hopefully that can kind of have a knock-on effect on how organizations operate as well. For instance, if there are more requirements or there's a push on that side as well for that. Yeah.
We also have 3 minutes left, so and I know that Uma needs to leave in time. I wanted to then perhaps end with a final question, and if people still have the time to tag along after that, that's fine. But I just wanted to ask Uma and Orisha, 5 years ahead in time, what would you ideally have achieved? What are your long-term perspectives on what you would like to get achieved in the coming years?
I think for the Racial Equity Index, we want to be able to have, a public searchable database of organizations that have taken annual assessments with us, so that we can track changes over time and organizations' commitments to racial equity, so that there's a measure of accountability. And the people that are holding these organizations accountable are not funders, but the people that work in this sector. I would love to see, along with that, we will also be doing a pulse check for the sector at large, which is what we're releasing next year, in terms of where the sector stands just generally on racial equity. And so continuing that and just seeing the change over time, because I think folks think that things are changing, but they definitely are not, unfortunately. There's a lot of stagnation. We've seen a lot of reduction in commitments to DEI initiatives and racial equity initiatives. We've seen a loss of funding and funders pulling their racial equity programs, which is devastating. So for us, it's more about pushing for transparency and accountability, and hopefully increasing in that, and then ensuring and hopefully creating a space where people who work in global development who are impacted by racial inequity feel like their stories are seen and heard and upheld and held by us at the Racial Equity Index.
I think for the equity index, in terms of about 5 years from now, we're just hoping, for us to secure the funding that we need and have a fully equitable recruitment process and team in place, ideally with individuals from the Global South. And once that is achieved, run the index with each segment in the UK development sector. And we aspire to just really be part of the landscape, working with organizations and networks who are also engaging in this work. And we see ourselves as a 1% solution here. And I think it's only by working with other organizations and individuals in the UK to really just contribute to increasing transparency in the sector and hopefully push for meaningful change as a result of that.
Great. I think that's a very clear call to all of us to ensure that, in order for you to keep your work moving on, we also need to be attentive and show interest. And I think that's really necessary. I want to end the Q&A and thank you both for participating today. I know you have to run. Thank you so much. We will make sure that the information and contact details of both the Racial Equity Index and Equity Index is available, and that you can send your follow-up questions. So know that you should reach out to them. And I do believe that they deserve a spot in the international development sphere, if we would like to call that anyway, international development, but they should really claim a spot and push for more accountability and work on equity in international development. So thank you so much. Thank everybody for listening in, and I'm wishing you a very pleasant rest of your day. Bye-bye.